There's a strange pattern in history. It appears across different centuries, different regions, and different types of institutions. And once you notice it, it becomes difficult to ignore. Certain families, certain names, certain financial houses, they arrive in the historical record fully formed. One generation they are absent. The next, they are present and significant, not building slowly in front of the record. Simply there, already powerful, already connected, already operating at a level that suggests a long and established foundation. And the official history, in most of these cases, begins exactly at that point of arrival, not before it. The story opens when the wealth is already visible, when the influence is already in place, when the name already carries meaning. Everything that came before that moment, the decisions, the transactions, the relationships that made the arrival possible, that part is either missing from the record, or present only in fragments that are difficult to piece together. This raises a question that is rarely asked directly in mainstream historical accounts. What exactly happened in the years, and sometimes the decades, before that official starting point? Where did the foundation come from? Not the visible foundation, the one that appears in documented records, but the earlier layer, the one that made the documented foundation possible in the first place. Who helped build it? What conditions allowed it to form? And why does the historical record tend to go quiet precisely during that earlier period? At first, the silence seems unremarkable. Records from earlier centuries are incomplete. Archives have been lost, damaged, or never properly maintained. It would be reasonable to assume that missing documentation is simply the result of time and poor preservation. And in many individual cases, that explanation is probably correct. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the silence in these cases does not appear to be random. It does not affect all areas of the record equally. In the same archives where the pre-wealth period is difficult to trace, other types of records from the same era survive. Local transactions, property documents, court records, letters between minor officials. The archive is incomplete, but selectively so. And the selection, in many of these cases, seems to consistently exclude precisely the period and the activities that would explain the origin most directly. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Then it begins to raise a different kind of question, not simply about what was lost to time, but about what was perhaps never recorded in the first place, or recorded and then removed, or recorded in forms that are no longer accessible to outside researchers. It doesn't fully make sense when you look closely at how wealth and influence actually accumulate. Not at that scale, not at the speed that many of these cases suggest. A family or institution that reaches significant financial and political power does not do so without a long preparatory period. There are relationships to establish. There's trust to build with specific actors in specific places. There's capital in some form that must be assembled before it can be deployed effectively. And all of that takes time, measured not in months, but in years, often in decades. The visible, documented history of many major institutions begins at the point where that preparatory work has already been completed. The first recorded transaction is often not the first transaction. The first documented partnership is often not the first relationship. The story, as it appears in official sources, picks up somewhere in the middle. And the beginning, the actual beginning, is precisely what tends to be missing. Wealth at that scale, influence at that level, it does not appear overnight. This is not a controversial claim. It is simply how accumulation works. Resources are gathered, connections are made. Knowledge about particular markets, or political environments, or social structures is acquired slowly through experience and access. Each of those steps leaves some kind of trace. A note, a ledger entry, a letter, a record of a meeting or an agreement. The process of building significant power and wealth is, by its nature, a process that generates documentation. But in many of these cases, those traces are either missing, incomplete, or strangely difficult to verify. The documentation that does exist often begins at a convenient point, after the foundational work has already been done. Before that point, the record thins out. Questions asked of the archive receive incomplete answers. Researchers who have followed these trails carefully describe a consistent experience. The closer they get to the actual origin, the less reliable the available material becomes. Some researchers have formally named this phenomenon. They call it the prehistory problem. The term refers specifically to the gap that exists between when a major institution or dynasty actually began forming, in functional, operational terms, and when it first appears clearly in the accepted historical record. The prehistory is the period before the official story starts, and it is, in many of the most studied cases, the period that most needs explaining. The prehistory problem has been discussed in academic contexts for several decades. It is not a fringe observation. Serious historians working on financial history, on the development of early banking institutions, on the origins of major industrial and commercial dynasties, many of them have noted the same structural gap. The accepted story begins at a particular point. What came before that point is acknowledged to be incompletely understood. The disagreement is not about whether the gap exists. It is about what the gap means. Some researchers believe the gap is not accidental, that the period before the official story is not simply underdocumented because of archival limitations, but because something about that period was deliberately kept from becoming part of the permanent record. The word deliberately is a careful one to use in historical analysis. It implies intention, and intention is difficult to prove across centuries. But the consistency of the pattern, the way the gap appears in case after case, across different geographies and different periods, leads some researchers to argue that chance alone is insufficient as an explanation. Others disagree. They maintain that the prehistory problem is a natural artifact of how historical records are created and preserved. In formal periods of accumulation, when arrangements are made between individuals rather than through institutions, naturally generate fewer durable records. When those individuals later become historically significant, the informal period of their development simply appears as a gap, not because it was hidden, but because it was never formally documented in the first place. This is also a reasonable position, and it may well explain a significant portion of the cases. What is certain is this: the official starting point, in most of these cases, is rarely the actual starting point. The story that is told in textbooks, in official institutional histories, in the accepted academic accounts, that story typically begins at a point of convenience, a point where documentation is available and verifiable, a point where the wealth and influence are already present and can be straightforwardly traced forward. What lies behind that point, the actual process of formation, is left in varying degrees of shadow, and that difference matters. It matters not only as a historical question, though it is certainly that. It matters because origin shapes outcome. The way that power and wealth are first assembled tends to influence how they are later used, what relationships they carry forward, what obligations and understandings are embedded in them from the earliest period. If the origin is unclear, then something fundamental about the nature of what followed is also unclear. The structure exists. It is visible and documented, but the foundation beneath the structure, the part that explains why it was built the way it was, that foundation, in many cases, has not been fully examined. This is not a comfortable observation. It sits at an angle to the way history is usually presented. Official accounts tend to begin at the beginning, or at what is presented as the beginning. They offer a starting point that feels grounded and verifiable. But grounded and verifiable are not the same as complete. A starting point can be accurate as far as it goes, and still represent only a portion of the actual story. The documentation can be real, while the picture it presents remains significantly partial. The question, then, is not whether these institutions and dynasties genuinely existed and genuinely accumulated power and wealth. That is not in doubt. The question is specifically about the period that the documentation skips or underrepresents, the period before the official story begins, the years or decades during which the foundation was actually laid, and the possibility, which neither can be confirmed nor dismissed based on available evidence, that what happened during that period would look quite different from what the official record suggests. Researchers who have examined this question closely tend to describe a particular experience. They begin with the documented record, which is often extensive and detailed from a certain point forward. They follow it backward, toward the origin, and at some stage in that process, the quality and completeness of the material changes. The documentation becomes thinner. The answers become less direct. Sources that should exist are absent. References point to materials that are unavailable or unverifiable. The trail does not end cleanly. It simply fades. And the point at which it fades is, in most cases, the point that matters most. That fading is what the prehistory problem describes. It is a structural feature of many major historical narratives about wealth and influence. And it remains, despite decades of serious scholarly attention, genuinely unresolved. Not because researchers have stopped looking, but because the material that would resolve it, the documentation from that earlier, formative period, is either not available, not complete, or not yet fully understood. What happened before their wealth appeared in official history? That is the question this investigation begins with. And it is the question that, at every stage of the historical record, the official account consistently fails to fully answer. The wealth is there. The influence is there. The documented story begins at a particular and convenient point. But the actual beginning, the moment when the foundation was first laid, when the first critical decisions were made, when the first essential relationships were formed, that moment remains, in case after case, just outside the reach of what the record clearly shows. And that is where this investigation begins, not with the documented story, but with the gap that exists before it. Every major fortune has an official origin story. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, expected. Institutions and families that accumulate significant wealth over generations tend to develop a documented account of how that process began. The account is preserved in authorized histories, in family archives, in the records of banks and trading houses, and in the academic literature that draws from those sources. It exists. It is referenced. And for most of human history, it has been accepted without serious challenge. The shape of these origin stories is remarkably consistent. A person, usually described as coming from modest or comfortable but unremarkable circumstances, identifies an opportunity that others have missed or underestimated. They make a decision. They commit to it. They work carefully and persistently. They make further decisions, most of which prove correct. And over time, through a combination of effort, judgment, and favorable timing, they build something that grows beyond the original opportunity into something much larger. The story has a beginning, a middle, and a clear trajectory. It is logical. It is legible. And it tends to be presented in a way that feels both earned and inevitable in hindsight. For many of the world's oldest and most powerful financial dynasties, this is precisely how the record presents the origin. The documentation tends to open with a specific and identifiable moment. A first transaction, a first recorded loan, a first letter that establishes contact with an important figure. From that point, the story moves forward in a traceable line. A small trade in one city leads to a slightly larger arrangement in another. A careful investment at the right moment produces a return that enables the next step. A connection made through a particular relationship opens a door that would otherwise have remained closed. Each stage is presented as following naturally from the one before it. Historians have worked carefully with these accounts. The archival research that supports many official origin stories is genuinely extensive. Old ledgers have been examined. Correspondence from a founding period has been analyzed. Dates have been cross-referenced across multiple sources. In many cases, the documented record is substantial. The letters exist. The transaction records exist. The names of early partners and associates are known. The official story does not simply claim to be true. It points to material evidence. And for a long time, most people accepted it, not out of naivety, but because the evidence appeared to support the account. When a story is consistent with the available documentation, and when that documentation has been examined by credentialed researchers, there is little obvious reason to question the conclusion. The story made sense on the surface. The record seemed to confirm it. And the conclusion, that these fortunes were built through legitimate effort, good judgment, and favorable circumstances, seemed like the most reasonable interpretation of the available material. But this is where the first small difficulty appears. And it is worth examining carefully, because it is not the kind of difficulty that announces itself clearly. It appears only when you look at the relationship between what documentation confirms and what documentation actually covers. Documentation existing is not the same as documentation being complete. These are two very different things. A record can be technically accurate, Every data it contains can be correct, every name can be verified, every transaction it describes can be confirmed, and still leave significant areas of the actual story entirely unaddressed. Accuracy and completeness are separate qualities. A document that accurately describes one aspect of a situation can simultaneously say nothing at all about the surrounding context. And the surrounding context, in many of these cases, is precisely where the important questions live. Consider what a typical founding document actually contains. It records what was transacted. It records between whom. It records the date and the amount. What it does not record is how the capital for that transaction was assembled in the first place. It does not record what earlier arrangements made that moment possible. It does not record what was agreed informally, in conversations that left no written trace. It does not record what the parties understood, but did not commit to paper. The document is accurate about what it covers. It simply does not cover everything. At first, this seems like a minor observation. Of course, historical documents are incomplete. No archive captures everything. That is simply the nature of historical evidence. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the incompleteness in these cases is not uniform. It does not affect all aspects of the record equally. In the same archives that contain detailed records of transactions and correspondence from the established period, once the wealth is visible and the institution is recognized, the earlier period tends to be represented differently. The documentation thins. The gaps become larger. The answers become less direct. That pattern is worth pausing on. If incompleteness were simply a function of age, older records surviving less well than newer ones, you would expect the documentation to thin consistently as you move further back in time. But that is not always what researchers find. In some cases, records from the general historical period survive quite well. Court documents, municipal records, trade guild accounts, church registries. These exist and are reasonably complete for the era. What is specifically thin or absent are the records that would speak directly to the pre-wealth period of the family or institution in question. The general archive is reasonably intact. The specific archive is selectively incomplete. The official record, in many of these cases, is not wrong exactly. That is an important distinction. This is not a claim that the documented history is fabricated or that the evidence has been deliberately falsified. The transactions that are recorded appear to be real. The letters that are cited appear to be genuine. The dates that are given appear to be accurate. The official record, as it stands, is defensible within its own terms. It is simply selective. It presents a version of the story that is accurate as far as it goes, but that consistently stops short of addressing certain categories of question. It answers the visible questions. It confirms the events that are easiest to confirm. It traces the trajectory from a particular point forward with considerable care and detail. What it does not do is address the period before that starting point in the same level of detail. And it does not explain why certain questions about the origin of early capital, about the nature of certain foundational relationships, about the source of particular advantages, remain without clear answers even after extensive archival research. Some of the unanswered questions are minor. Historical research always leaves loose ends. Not every detail can be fully resolved, and not every gap represents something significant. But some of the unanswered questions are not minor at all. They concern things that should be answerable if the documentation were complete. How was the initial capital assembled? Through what specific channels did the most consequential early relationships form? What enabled a particular decision to be made at a particular time? What information or resource made it possible? These are not peripheral questions. They are central to understanding how the origin actually functioned. And in many cases, the official record provides answers that are either partial, or indirect, or simply absent. This raises a broader question about how official records are created in the first place. Historical documentation is not a neutral process. Archives are assembled by people, maintained by institutions, and made accessible according to decisions that reflect priorities and interests. What is preserved, what is cataloged, and what is made available to researchers are all outcomes of choices. Choices made over long periods of time by different actors, with different motivations. This does not mean that archives are systematically dishonest, but it does mean that what survives in an archive is not simply a random sample of everything that once existed. It is a filtered sample, and the filter has a shape. In the case of major financial and dynastic institutions, many of the most significant archives have been maintained by the institutions themselves or by bodies closely associated with them. Family archives, institutional records, authorized historical collections. These are often the primary sources for the official origin story, and they are, in many cases, genuine and valuable historical resources. Researchers have found important material in them, but they are also archives that were assembled and preserved by parties with a direct interest in how the origin story is understood. That does not automatically make them unreliable, but it does raise a question about selection. What was preserved and what was not? What was made accessible to researchers? And what remains restricted or unavailable? These are not accusations. They are simply questions that the nature of the archival situation makes reasonable to ask. And they are questions that, in most cases, the official record does not directly address. The existence of an authorized archive is presented as evidence of transparency, but an authorized archive is not the same as a complete archive. And the difference between those two things is precisely where the uncertainty in the official record lives. Researchers who have worked with these materials over long careers tend to describe a particular experience. They note that the official record is genuinely useful and genuinely informative about many aspects of a story. They do not dismiss it, but they also note that it consistently performs better in some areas than in others. It is detailed and reliable about the period after the wealth became established. It is less detailed and less reliable about the transitional period, the years when the foundation was being laid but had not yet become visible. And it is thinnest of all about the period immediately before the official story begins. The very period that would explain the most is the period that the official record covers least. This is not a conclusion. It is an observation about the structure of the available evidence. The official record exists. It is extensive in certain areas. It is the product of serious historical work, and it tells a story that is internally consistent and largely verifiable within its own scope. But internally consistent is not the same as complete, and verifiable within its own scope is not the same as fully explanatory. The official record answers many questions clearly, but it leaves others, including some of the most important ones, without the kind of direct and documented answer that the significance of those questions would seem to require. And that gap between what the official record clearly answers and what it quietly leaves open is not a small gap. It is not a minor archival inconvenience. In many of these cases, it sits at the center of the story. The wealth is documented from a certain point forward. The influence is traceable from a certain point forward. But what made that point possible? What happened just before the official story begins? That part remains, in case after case, in a kind of organized and persistent shadow, present enough to be acknowledged, absent enough to remain unexplained. When researchers begin to look more carefully at the actual timeline of major wealth accumulation, not the summary version, not the official narrative, but the specific year-by-year progression of documented capital, something begins to feel uncomfortable. It is not a feeling that announces itself immediately. It builds slowly, as the numbers are examined more closely and the documented explanations are held against the documented outcomes. And at a certain point, the two things stop fitting together as neatly as the official account suggests they should. The rate of accumulation does not match the explanation. That is the core of the problem, and it is worth being precise about what that means, because it is easy to misread the claim. This is not about whether the wealth was real. It was. It is not about whether the documented transactions occurred. They did. The issue is specifically about rate, about speed, about the relationship between what the documented sources of income and capital could have produced within a given period, and what the documented outcomes show actually existed by the end of that period. In straightforward terms, the numbers, when examined carefully, do not always add up. And in historical analysis, when numbers do not add up, that is not a minor issue. It is a signal. It suggests that something in the picture is incomplete. Either the documented sources of growth are not the only sources, or the documented starting point is not the actual starting point, or both. This is the first real problem with the official record, not a theory built on suspicion, not an assumption made without evidence, a mathematical observation made by researchers who have worked directly with the original documents. When a fortune begins at a certain recorded point, with a certain recorded amount of capital, and grows through means that are documented and traceable, the progression from start to outcome should follow a path that can be explained at each stage. The numbers should be accountable. Each increase should be traceable to a source. The growth, however impressive, should be proportional to what the documented activity could have produced. In several well-studied cases, it is not. The growth is faster than the documented sources explain. The capital available at certain points appears to exceed what the recorded income and investment returns could have generated. This has been noted not by critics looking to challenge the official story, but by historians working directly with the archival material, attempting to reconstruct the financial timeline as accurately as possible. And they have found in multiple cases that the reconstruction does not fully close. There are periods where the documented inputs and the documented outcomes do not reconcile without remainder. At first, this seems like it might have a simple explanation, and there are several explanations that historians have offered. Early accounting was imprecise. Records from certain periods used different conventions for what was counted and how. Informal arrangements between trusted parties were common and often left no written trace. Currency values fluctuated in ways that complicate modern reconstruction. Inheritance, gifts, and informal transfers of assets between family members were not always documented in the way that formal transactions were. All of these factors are real. They genuinely complicate the task of reconstructing historical financial timelines, and they may well account for some portion of the discrepancy in many cases, but they do not fully resolve the issue. And this is where the explanation starts to become difficult, because if imprecise accounting and informal arrangements were sufficient to explain the gaps, then the gaps should appear throughout the timeline in a relatively uniform way. Imprecision, by its nature, does not target specific moments. Informal arrangements were common throughout the relevant periods, not only at certain stages. If those factors are the explanation, the resulting gaps in the record should be distributed somewhat evenly across the timeline. Present in early periods, present in middle periods, present in later periods, reflecting the general conditions of documentation at the time. But that is not what researchers tend to find. The gaps do not appear evenly. They cluster. They concentrate around particular periods, specific years, specific transitions, specific moments in the institutional or family history that correspond to major expansions, significant new relationships, or the opening of important new markets. Before those moments, the record is thin. After them, it becomes much fuller and more detailed. The transition from thin documentation to full documentation coincides, in case after case, with a step change in the scale of the operation. That pattern is worth examining carefully, because it is precisely what you would not expect if the gaps were purely a product of general archival incompleteness. General incompleteness would produce general gaps. What is observed instead is targeted incompleteness, gaps that appear at the moments that matter most, and that clear up once the wealth is already established and visible. The thinness in the record is not spread across the timeline. It is located at the hinges, at the turning points, at exactly the moments where understanding what happened would most directly explain the origin of what followed. This raises questions that the official explanation does not comfortably address. If the growth during those periods was produced through the same kinds of documented activities that are visible in the fuller periods of the record, the same types of trades, the same types of loans, the same types of investments, then why is the documentation for those specific periods so much thinner? The activity was presumably the same. The documentation of similar activity in later periods is extensive. Why would the documentation be specifically absent at the moments of greatest acceleration? Some researchers have proposed that the answer lies in the nature of the activities themselves, that the periods of fastest growth coincide with the periods of thinnest documentation not by accident, but because the activities generating that growth were different in kind from the activities that are well documented, not necessarily illegal by the standards of their time, but informal, conducted through channels that were deliberately kept off the main record, arrangements that both parties understood clearly, and that neither party had reason to commit fully to paper. If that is the case, then the thinning of the record at key moments is not a failure of preservation. It is a feature of how certain types of early accumulation actually worked. Others disagree with that interpretation. They maintain that the clustering of gaps around transition points is not as statistically significant as it might appear. That when you are looking for a pattern, you tend to find it. That the transitions themselves are defined partly by the availability of documentation, which creates a circular appearance of correlation. This is a methodological critique rather than a factual one, and it has some validity. The question of whether the pattern is genuinely significant or partly a product of how the analysis is structured is a real and unresolved debate among researchers. However, the timeline does not fully match the official explanation in ways that survive even careful methodological scrutiny. The capital available at certain transition points, documented in the records that do exist, appears to exceed what the prior documented period could have produced. This is not a pattern recognition issue. It is an arithmetic issue. The numbers in the surviving documents, taken at face value, do not add up to the documented outcome without a remainder that needs explaining. And that remainder, that unexplained portion, tends to be largest precisely at the transition points where the documentation is also thinnest. What makes this particularly worth attention is the consistency with which it appears across different cases, in different countries, in different centuries, and in different industries. The same structural feature, rapid growth during a period of thin documentation, followed by a transition to full documentation once the wealth is established, appears in the history of early banking families in medieval and early modern Europe, in the records of major trading companies from the colonial period, and in the origins of several industrial dynasties from the 18th and 19th centuries. It is not unique to one time or one place. It is a recurring feature of how major wealth appears in the historical record. That recurrence matters. A single case could be explained by local archival conditions. Two cases might be coincidence. But when the same structural pattern appears across many unrelated cases, in different archival contexts, across different centuries, the explanation of archival chance becomes less satisfying. The pattern is not universal. There are cases where the documentation is more complete, and the growth rates are more fully explainable. But the cases where the pattern does appear are numerous enough, and well-studied enough, to warrant serious attention. The question that the pattern raises is a specific one. It is not a question about whether these fortunes were real, or whether the people who built them were capable and intelligent. The answer to both of those questions appears to be yes. The question is specifically about the periods of fastest growth, about what was happening during the years when the record is thinnest and the accumulation was most rapid, about what sources of capital, what relationships, what arrangements were present during those periods that do not appear in the documentation that survived. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the period of fastest growth is not a peripheral episode in the history of these institutions. It is often the foundational episode, the moment when the scale of the operation changed permanently, when what had been a modest enterprise became something much larger, when the connections that would define the institution for generations were first formed. Understanding what actually happened during that period is not a minor historical footnote. It is central to understanding the origin of the institution itself. And yet it is precisely that period, the one that matters most, that the official record covers least. The documentation is thin where understanding would be most valuable. The numbers do not fully close at the moments of greatest transition. The rate of accumulation does not match the documented explanation at the points where the explanation is most needed. These are not peripheral observations. They sit at the center of what the official record leaves unresolved. Researchers continue to work with the available material. Some believe the gaps will eventually be filled as new archival sources are identified and examined. Others believe that the material that would fill the gaps no longer exists, or was never created in the first place. Neither position has been conclusively established. What is established is the gap itself, the discrepancy between what the documented sources of growth could have produced and what the documented outcomes show actually existed. That discrepancy is present. It has been noted by serious researchers working directly with the primary sources, and it has not, in most cases, been fully explained by the official account or by the standard archival explanations offered in its defense. The numbers do not lie, but they also do not always speak clearly. In these cases, they point toward a period of accumulation that the documentary record does not fully illuminate. And that gap between what the numbers suggest and what the documents explain is where the first real problem with the official story lives. Not at the edges of the history, at its center. To understand the problem more fully, it helps to step back from the specific numbers and the specific gaps in documentation and look instead at something broader: the environment, the conditions that existed during the periods when these foundational fortunes were being assembled. Because context matters in history. The circumstances surrounding an event shape what was possible, what was likely, and what kinds of activities could occur without leaving a clear trace. And the circumstances surrounding the early accumulation of major wealth are, in many of the most studied cases, remarkably similar to one another. The periods in question, and they vary depending on which case is being examined, which century, which region, which institution, tend to share a recognizable set of characteristics. They are not periods of stability. They are not periods where established rules are firmly in place and consistently enforced. They are periods of transition, of movement, of old structures losing their grip while new ones are still forming. And that particular condition, the gap between the old order and the new one, creates an environment that functions very differently from the stable periods that come before and after it. Political instability is one of the defining features of these transition periods. Governments change. Alliances shift. The authority that controls a given territory or trade network at the beginning of a decade may be entirely different from the authority that controls it at the end. In that kind of environment, the rules that govern commerce, finance, and the movement of value are not fixed. They are negotiated, interpreted, and sometimes simply ignored by those with enough access and enough flexibility to operate across the shifting boundaries. This is not a minor detail. It is the central condition that made certain types of early accumulation possible. Shifting trade routes matter as well. When the established paths for moving goods and capital are disrupted by war, by the opening of new territories, by the collapse of a previously dominant trading power, new paths open. And the people who identify those new paths first, who position themselves at the new junctions before they become visible to everyone else, gain an advantage that is very difficult to replicate once the new order stabilizes. That kind of early positioning is enormously valuable, but it is also, by its nature, the kind of activity that occurs before the new structure is formalized, before the rules are written, before the documentation systems that will govern the new order are in place. Wars ending or beginning create their own particular set of conditions. The end of a conflict produces an environment where assets are being redistributed, where debts are being settled or abandoned, where the losers are disposing of resources and the winners are absorbing them. The beginning of a conflict produces demand for supplies, for credit, for information about what is happening and where. Both conditions create opportunities for those who are positioned correctly and who have the right relationships. And both conditions are periods where the normal systems of documentation and oversight are either suspended, overwhelmed, or simply not functioning as they would in peacetime. This matters because it means that transactions which would be traceable under normal conditions can occur during these periods with far less visibility. Currencies changing is another feature of these transition periods that receives less attention than it deserves. When the monetary system shifts, when a new coinage is introduced, when a currency is debased, when the accepted medium of exchange in a region changes, those who understand the transition before others can move value in ways that are very difficult to reconstruct afterward. The records that survive from such periods often reflect the new monetary system. What happened during the transition itself, when value was moving between old and new forms, is frequently much harder to trace. And it is often during precisely these monetary transitions that significant early accumulation occurs. These conditions matter, not as background detail, but as active factors in the process of early wealth formation. Because in periods defined by these characteristics, political instability, shifting trade routes, conflict, monetary change, certain types of transactions become possible that would not be possible in more settled times. Value can move without clear documentation. Relationships can form across boundaries that would later become harder to cross. Agreements can be made informally, between parties who trust each other enough not to require written confirmation, and who have good reasons not to create a written record that might later become visible to hostile eyes. Historians largely agree on this general context. The transition periods of history are well studied. The conditions they created are well understood in broad terms. The disagreement is not about whether these conditions existed. It is about what happened within them, about which specific actors took advantage of which specific conditions, and through which specific means, and about how much of what happened during these periods eventually found its way into the documentary record, and how much did not. The official accounts of major fortune origins tend to emphasize the legitimate opportunities that these transition periods created, and those opportunities were entirely real. Trade did expand when old monopolies collapsed. New markets did open when old barriers fell. Those who moved quickly and positioned themselves intelligently in the new landscape did profit significantly. The official story is not wrong to emphasize this. Legitimate opportunity existed, and it was genuinely seized by some of the actors whose stories are being examined. But there is a secondary layer to these periods that receives considerably less attention in the official accounts. And this is where the explanation starts to become incomplete, because in the same periods that produced legitimate commercial opportunity, other kinds of arrangements were also being made. Not all actors in a transition period prosper through the same channels. Some benefit from the opening of new legitimate trade. Others benefit from proximity to conflict, from being close enough to wars, to political struggles, to the redistribution of assets that follows from them, to gain advantages that had nothing to do with commercial skill or market judgment. Proximity to conflict is a specific kind of advantage. It provides access to information about what is happening before that information becomes public. It provides relationships with actors on multiple sides of a struggle, which creates the ability to facilitate transactions that neither side can conduct directly. It provides opportunities to acquire assets from distressed sellers, from those who are losing and need to convert holdings into portable value quickly, at prices that reflect the distress rather than the underlying worth. None of these activities necessarily violated the norms of their time, but they are also not what the official accounts typically describe when they explain how the foundational wealth was built. Access to information that was not public is another channel that appears less prominently in the official record than its likely importance warrants. In the transition periods where major wealth formation often occurred, information was not evenly distributed. Those with certain relationships, with political actors, with military commanders, with officials who knew what decisions were being made before those decisions became public, possessed an advantage that was immensely valuable and almost impossible to document. Acting on that kind of advanced knowledge produced results that look, from the outside, like exceptional market judgment. But the judgment was not purely analytical. It was informed, and the source of the information, in most cases, does not appear in the record. And then there are the relationships with actors whose own origins are equally unclear. This is perhaps the most difficult element to examine directly, because the financial histories of major dynasties do not exist in isolation. They are connected to the histories of other actors, other families, other institutions, other individuals whose roles in the transition periods are also imperfectly documented. When two parties with unclear origins are connected to each other, reconstructing the nature of that connection is extremely difficult. The records of one party reference the other in terms that are already established. Neither party's record contains the earlier layer where the connection actually formed. The relationship appears in the documentation already present, already consequential, with no visible beginning. How much of early wealth came from legitimate commercial opportunity? And how much came from these secondary channels, proximity to conflict, access to non-public information, relationships with actors operating outside the clear documentary record? That question is rarely answered directly in official accounts, and the rarity of a direct answer is itself worth noting. These are not small questions. They concern the fundamental character of the foundational accumulation, whether the origin was primarily commercial or whether it involved significant elements of a different kind. That distinction matters. It shapes how the entire subsequent history is understood. Some historians argue that the distinction between legitimate and less clearly legitimate activity in these transition periods is itself somewhat artificial. The norms of earlier centuries were different. What would be considered improper access to information or conflict-adjacent accumulation by modern standards was often simply how commerce worked in the relevant periods. The boundaries between political power, military activity, and commercial advantage were not clearly drawn. Actors who moved between those domains were not violating norms. They were operating within them. This is a reasonable point, but does not resolve the underlying question of what actually happened. It simply reframes it. Others argue that the emphasis on transition periods as the context for foundational accumulation is itself a partial explanation, that it describes the environment without identifying the specific mechanisms, that knowing a fortune was built during a period of political instability does not tell you how it was built within that instability. The context narrows the possibilities, but it does not identify which of the remaining possibilities actually occurred. And until that identification is made, the official account, however accurate it is about the general environment, remains incomplete about the specific process. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The general context is acknowledged. The existence of transition conditions is not disputed. The reality of legitimate opportunity within those conditions is not in question. What remains unclear is the specific combination of channels through which the foundational accumulation actually occurred. The official account identifies some of those channels clearly, but the channels it identifies may not be sufficient to account for the full outcome, and the channels it does not clearly identify, the secondary layer, the proximity to conflict, the informational advantages, the relationships whose origins are not visible, those remain in a kind of documented silence that the official account has not resolved. The environment was real. The opportunities were real. The question of which opportunities, through which channels, producing which portion of the foundational wealth, that part remains, across many of the most studied cases, genuinely and persistently unclear. There is a specific type of historical analysis that operates differently from conventional archival research. It does not begin with a document and ask what that document reveals. It begins with an outcome, a known, recorded, verifiable result, and works backward. It asks a different kind of question, not what happened, but what would have had to happen to produce this particular result. What conditions would have been required? What resources would have been necessary? What rate of growth, sustained over what period of time, through what kinds of activities, would have been needed to arrive at the documented outcome from the documented starting point? This method is sometimes called reverse reconstruction. It is used in financial history when the forward record, the documentation moving from origin to outcome, is incomplete or inconsistent. Instead of following the trail forward and noting where it breaks, the analyst starts at the end and works backward, using the known outcome as a fixed reference point and asking what the journey to that point must have looked like, given what is mathematically required. It is a careful and methodical approach, and when it is applied to several major fortune origins, the results are, in the assessment of the researchers who have conducted this work, uncomfortable. The discomfort does not come from what the method reveals about the later period. The later period, in most of these cases, is reasonably well documented. The transactions are recorded. The growth is traceable. The numbers from a certain point forward close within acceptable margins. The discomfort comes from the earlier period, from the gap between the documented starting point and the documented outcome, from what the reverse reconstruction suggests must have existed or occurred during a period that the forward record does not clearly illuminate. To understand this more concretely, it helps to consider the general structure of the problem without attaching it to any single specific case. Imagine a documented starting capital, a recorded amount of resources available to an institution at an identifiable early moment. Imagine a documented set of activities over the following decades, the loans extended, the interest collected, the investments placed, the partnerships formed. And imagine a documented outcome several generations later, the total capital and influence of the institution at a point where the record becomes substantially fuller. The question is whether the journey from the starting point to the outcome is fully accounted for by the documented activities in between. In several well-studied European cases involving prominent early banking families and major trading houses, the answer, after careful analysis, appears to be not entirely. The documented starting capital is clear. The loans made in the early decades are recorded in surviving ledgers. The interest earned is calculable from those records. The investments placed are noted, where documentation exists. And yet the capital available by the third and fourth generation of these institutions is significantly larger than the straightforward trajectory from the documented starting point through the documented activities would predict. The outcome is substantially greater than the inputs, as recorded, would produce. That gap between the predicted outcome and the actual documented outcome is what the reverse reconstruction identifies and cannot close through the forward record alone. Some portion of that gap can be explained through channels that historians have traced carefully. Inheritance through strategic marriages brought outside capital into several of these institutions at important moments. Partnerships with other actors whose own resources supplemented the internal trajectory. Windfalls from particular transactions that produced returns beyond what the standard rate of the period would suggest. Historians have examined these channels in detail. They have credited them appropriately in the reconstruction. And even after accounting for all of them, every documented inheritance, every recorded partnership, every identifiable windfall, a portion of the gap in several cases remains, not fully explained by the sum of all documented sources. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the standard response to this observation, the explanation most commonly offered by those who defend the completeness of the official record, is that informal arrangements account for the remainder. That early commerce operated partly through formal documented channels and partly through informal ones. That trusted relationships between established actors regularly produced arrangements that were never written down, or that were recorded in forms that no longer survive. That the gap between the documented inputs and the documented outcome simply reflects the informal portion of the economy, which was real and significant, but is now largely invisible to historians. This explanation is reasonable. It reflects genuine features of how early commerce functioned. Informal arrangements were real. Undocumented transactions occurred regularly. The surviving record does not capture everything that happened. These points are not in dispute. The difficulty is not with the explanation itself, but with what the explanation implies if it is accepted as the primary account of the gap. If informal arrangements were common enough and consistent enough across multiple cases, across different regions, across different centuries, to account for gaps of the magnitude that researchers have identified, then the official record is not occasionally incomplete. It is structurally incomplete, systematically so, not missing pieces around the edges of the picture, but missing a significant portion of the actual activity at the center of it. And that is a different kind of incompleteness than the kind that is usually acknowledged when the official record is cited as evidence. This raises a question that is not minor. If the official record is structurally incomplete, if the documented transactions represent not the full picture, but only one layer of a two-layer system, where the second layer consists of informal arrangements that left no durable trace, then what exactly does the official record tell us? What does it actually represent? It represents the visible layer, the portion that was documented, preserved, and made available to researchers. But if the visible layer consistently understates the full reality by a significant margin, then conclusions drawn from the visible layer alone are conclusions about an incomplete picture. And conclusions about an incomplete picture can be accurate within their own scope, while still being substantially misleading about the whole. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the official record is not simply used by historians for scholarly reconstruction. It is the foundation of the accepted public understanding of how major wealth was built. It is what institutional histories are based on. It is what authorized accounts reference when they explain the origin. If the official record is structurally incomplete in the way that the reverse reconstruction analysis suggests, then the accepted public understanding is built on a foundation that is more partial than it appears. Not fabricated, not deliberately false, but partial, systematically partial. Some historians respond to this by arguing that structural incompleteness is a universal feature of historical records from these periods, not a specific characteristic of the cases being examined. That all financial history from early modern Europe, for example, involves similar gaps between the formal and informal economies. That the cases attracting scrutiny are not unusual in this respect. They simply attract more scrutiny because of their prominence. This is a fair point. And it may well be correct that the structural incompleteness is a general feature rather than a specific one. But even if that is true, it does not resolve the underlying problem. It simply extends it. If structural incompleteness is universal across the relevant period, then the official records from that period are universally partial. And if they are universally partial, then the accepted historical understanding of how major wealth was built during those periods, drawing primarily from those records, is also universally partial. The scope of the problem becomes larger, not smaller. The question of what the official record is leaving out becomes more significant, not less. Others disagree with the framing of the problem itself. They argue that the gap identified by reverse reconstruction is not as large or as consistent as critics suggest, that the methodology involves assumptions about interest rates, about average returns, about the value of assets in historical currencies, that introduce margins of error large enough to explain the apparent discrepancy without requiring any undocumented activity, that what looks like an unexplained remainder is in fact within the range of uncertainty that the methodology itself produces. This is a technical argument and a legitimate one. The methodology of historical financial reconstruction does involve assumptions. Those assumptions do create margins of error, and it is possible that in some cases, the apparent gap falls within that margin. However, the timeline does not fully match this reassurance in all cases. Researchers who have been most careful about their assumptions, who have used conservative estimates and wide margins of error in their reconstructions, still find, in several specific cases, a remainder that exceeds the methodological uncertainty. The gap is not always eliminable by adjusting the assumptions. In the cases that have received the most detailed scholarly attention, something remains after all reasonable adjustments have been made. And that something, that persistent, irreducible remainder, is what the standard explanation of incomplete records and informal arrangements is asked to account for. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because informal arrangements, by definition, cannot be verified. They cannot be documented after the fact. They cannot be precisely quantified. Invoking them as the explanation for a gap in the record is logically valid. Informal arrangements did exist and did matter, but is also an explanation that cannot be confirmed or denied through the available evidence. It is an explanation that fills the gap conceptually without filling it evidentially, and an explanation that fills a gap without evidence is, in the strictest sense, not yet a resolution. It is a placeholder, a reasonable one, perhaps, but a placeholder nonetheless. What the official record actually tells us, given all of this, is something more limited than it is usually presented as being. It tells us about the visible, documented layer of activity. It confirms that certain transactions occurred, that certain relationships existed, that certain investments were made. It provides a real and valuable partial account of the process of accumulation, but it does not provide a complete account. And the portion it leaves incomplete, the informal layer, the undocumented arrangements, the activities that either never entered the record or did not survive in it, is not a small portion. It is, in several of the most studied cases, the portion that accounts for the difference between what the documented inputs would produce and what the documented outcomes show. What the official record is leaving out, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps simply as a consequence of how historical documentation works, is the part of the story that would most directly explain the full scale of what was eventually built. The numbers, examined carefully and worked backward from the known outcomes, point toward that missing portion consistently. They do not identify it. They do not describe it, but they mark its location clearly, in the space between what the documented record explains and what the documented outcome requires. That space is real, and it has not been closed. One of the more persistent puzzles in the history of major wealth accumulation is not about numbers. It is not about rates of growth or capital trajectories, or the mathematical gap between documented inputs and documented outcomes. It is about something more human than that. It is about relationships, about the specific connections between people and institutions that made certain expansions possible, about when those connections formed, how they formed, and why the record of their formation is, in many of the most consequential cases, either absent or extraordinarily thin. Relationships are the infrastructure of wealth accumulation at the highest levels. This is not a controversial observation. It is simply how large-scale commerce and finance have always worked. Capital alone does not explain the rise of major institutions. Access does. Trust does. The ability to move through particular doors, to reach particular people, to operate within particular networks. These are the mechanisms that convert capital into sustained influence. And those mechanisms are built through relationships, through specific, individual connections between specific people, formed at specific moments, under specific circumstances. This is why the question of when key relationships began is not a minor archival curiosity. It is a central question about how the foundational structures of major wealth were actually assembled. The timing of a relationship matters. The circumstances of its formation matter. Whether a connection was made through a public and traceable channel, or through a private and undocumented one, shapes what the relationship reveals about the broader process of accumulation. And in multiple documented cases across the history of major financial dynasties and institutions, the most important relationships, the ones that proved most consequential, are precisely the ones whose origins the record does not clearly show. When researchers examine the archives of major financial institutions and prominent historical families, they encounter a pattern that appears with enough regularity to be worth careful attention. Powerful alliances appear in the documentation already fully formed. Two families, or two institutions, or a family and a political actor, are suddenly present in the record as established partners. The tone of the surviving correspondence, where correspondence exists, suggests a relationship of long standing. The terms of the documented arrangements suggest a level of mutual trust and familiarity that takes time to develop. Everything about the way the connection appears in the record implies a prior history. But that prior history is not in the record. There is no documented introduction, no early letter establishing first contact, no record of a first meeting or a first transaction between the parties. They simply appear, connected, already past the beginning, already operating at a level of established partnership that the record provides no account of reaching. At first, this seems like it might have a straightforward explanation, and historians generally offer one. Not every letter that was written has survived. Not every meeting that took place was recorded in a form that has been preserved. The archives of even the most carefully maintained institutions are incomplete. Earlier centuries did not have the record-keeping infrastructure of later ones. Correspondence was often conducted verbally, or through trusted intermediaries, rather than through written letters. The absence of documentation for the beginning of a relationship does not mean the beginning did not occur in a normal and unremarkable way. It may simply mean that whatever documentation it produced has not survived. This explanation is fair. It reflects genuine limitations of historical archives, and it may well be the correct explanation in many individual cases. But this is where the explanation starts to weaken, because it depends on an assumption of uniform incompleteness. It works as an explanation only if the surviving archive is incomplete in a general and non-selective way, if the gaps in documentation appear throughout the record without a particular pattern. But that is not what researchers consistently find. In the same archives where the origins of certain key relationships are absent, other relationships from the same period are documented in considerable detail. Early letters between parties who later became important partners have survived. First transactions between families or institutions who eventually develop significant alliances are recorded in the ledgers. The beginning of relationships that proved moderately important is traceable, step by step, through the available material. The archive is incomplete, but it is not uniformly incomplete. Some relationships are documented from their earliest moments. Others appear already established, with no visible origin. And this is where it becomes unclear, because the relationships that appear without a visible origin are not, on average, the less important ones. They are not the peripheral connections. They are not the relationships with minor actors whose absence from the early record would be unremarkable. The ones with no visible origin tend to be specifically and consistently the relationships that proved most consequential, the partnerships that enabled the largest expansions of capital, the alliances that opened access to the most significant political or financial networks, the connections that, in retrospect, appear to have been foundational to the entire subsequent trajectory of the institution. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. because the pattern it describes is precisely the opposite of what random archival incompleteness would produce. If the gaps in documentation were random, if letters and records were lost without reference to the importance of the relationships they concerned, then the relationships with missing origins would be distributed roughly proportionally across the spectrum of importance. Some consequential relationships would have missing origins. Some minor ones would too. The pattern would not correlate with significance, but the correlation is there. It is not absolute. There are exceptions. Some consequential relationships are well documented from the beginning, and some minor relationships have missing early records. But the tendency, the consistent lean toward the most important relationships having the least visible origins, is present across enough cases to be noted by researchers who have examined the archives carefully. It is not a product of selective attention. It appears in the material itself. However, the timeline does not fully match the archival accident explanation in another respect as well. Beyond the question of which relationships have missing origins, there is a secondary problem involving the relationships that do appear with full early documentation. When you examine those relationships closely, the ones where the beginning is traceable, where early letters exist and first transactions are recorded, a pattern emerges about what kind of relationships they are. They tend to be relationships with actors who are not among the most powerful or most consequential. They tend to be the working relationships of commerce, suppliers, local agents, minor officials, regional partners, the infrastructure of daily business. These are documented from the beginning. Their origins are visible. The relationships with actors who were powerful, with other major financial houses, with political figures of significant influence, with institutions that controlled access to important resources or markets. Those are the ones that appear already formed, already established, already past whatever process of formation produced them. This raises questions that the official record does not comfortably address. Why would the formation of the most important relationships be specifically underdocumented, while the formation of less consequential ones is well preserved? One possible answer is that the most important relationships were formed through channels that were deliberately kept off the main correspondence record, that parties who were entering into arrangements of significant consequence had reasons, practical, political, or otherwise, to avoid creating written documentation of the early stages of their connection, that the absence of early records for the most consequential relationships is not an archival accident, but a reflection of how those relationships were actually formed. Some historians are willing to engage with this possibility directly. They note that in the historical periods in question, certain types of arrangements between powerful actors were routinely conducted through intermediaries rather than through direct correspondence. The intermediaries were trusted, known to both parties, and operated in person rather than in writing. The relationship could be established, the terms understood, and the initial arrangement made without a single letter passing between the principals. Later, once the relationship was established and operating normally, correspondence would begin, because at that point, there was no longer anything in the correspondence that either party would want to keep off the record. The relationship was simply a working relationship by then. Its origins were already safely in the past. Others disagree with this interpretation. They maintain that it attributes too much deliberateness to what is more simply explained by archival chance and informal communication practices of earlier centuries. That reading a pattern of selective documentation into what may be a random survival of records is a form of confirmation bias. That the researcher who is looking for a pattern in which relationships have documented origins and which do not will tend to find the pattern they are looking for, regardless of whether it is genuinely there. This is a legitimate methodological concern. The challenge of distinguishing genuine patterns from the appearance of patterns in incomplete historical data is real, and it means that the observation about which relationships have visible origins and which do not cannot, by itself, be treated as conclusive. It is an observation that requires careful interpretation, and the interpretation is genuinely disputed. What is not disputed is the observation itself. The relationships with the most consequential outcomes are, in multiple studied cases, the ones with the least visible beginnings. That is present in the material. Researchers on different sides of the interpretive debate acknowledge the same underlying observation. They disagree about what it means, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. because the two main interpretations lead to very different conclusions about the nature of the foundational relationships that shape these institutions. If the missing origins are simply archival accidents, then the relationships were formed normally, through channels that simply happen not to have left durable records. The connections were made, but the early correspondence was lost. The relationship is no less legitimate for being underdocumented. If, on the other hand, the missing origins reflect a pattern in how certain relationships were actually formed, through channels that were kept off the record because the circumstances of the formation required privacy, then the relationships carry a different character, not necessarily problematic by the standards of their time, but different from what the official account implies when it presents the institution's network of alliances as straightforwardly traceable. Why those particular relationships, the most important ones, the ones that opened the most significant doors, would have less documentation of their beginning than the minor and routine ones is a question the official record does not answer. It acknowledges the absence. In most cases, it attributes it to archival limitation, but it does not explain why the archival limitation is specifically concentrated among the connections that mattered most. And that unexplained concentration is where this particular puzzle continues to sit, unresolved, present in the material, waiting for an explanation that the available record has not yet provided. At a certain point in any careful investigation, it becomes necessary to step back from the individual case being examined and look at something larger. Not the specific numbers of one particular institution, not the missing correspondence of one particular family, not the documentation gap at one particular transition point, but the pattern that emerges when multiple cases are placed beside each other and examined for structural similarities. Because individual anomalies can be dismissed, they can be attributed to local conditions, to specific archival circumstances, to the particular history of one institution in one region during one period. But when the same anomalies appear across different cases, in different centuries, in different regions, in different industries, the local explanation becomes harder to sustain. This is where the investigation reaches a different level of observation, not the detail of one case, but the architecture of many. And what that architecture reveals, when examined carefully and without predetermined conclusions, is a structural similarity that is consistent enough to be genuinely worth explaining. Not identical in every detail, not present in every instance, but recognizable, recurring, present in enough cases, across enough different contexts, that the question of why it keeps appearing is one that the official account has not adequately addressed. The pattern has several components. They have been examined individually in earlier parts of this investigation, but when they are placed together, when the rate inconsistency, the missing early relationships, the documentation gaps at key transitions, and the convenient starting points of official origin stories are all considered as parts of a single recurring structure, the cumulative picture is different from what any one component suggests on its own. Individually, each element can be explained by local conditions or archival chance. Together, they form something that is harder to explain that way. The first component of the pattern is the official starting point. Across many of the cases that have been most carefully studied, the accepted narrative of origin begins at a specific and identifiable moment. A first recorded transaction, a first dated letter, a first documented loan or investment. That moment is presented as the beginning of the story, and it is, in a formal sense, where the documented evidence begins. But the quality of that starting point, its clarity, its convenience, the way the documentation suddenly becomes much fuller from that point forward, raises a question. Was this moment chosen as the starting point because it genuinely represents the beginning of the process, or because it is the earliest moment at which the available documentation supports a coherent narrative? Those are different things. A genuine beginning would be the point at which the institution or family first began accumulating in a meaningful way. A convenient starting point would be the earliest moment at which the surviving documentation is rich enough to tell a clean story. If the convenient starting point and the genuine beginning coincide, there is no problem. But if the genuine beginning predates the convenient starting point, if meaningful accumulation was already occurring before the documentation becomes clear, then the official origin story begins in the middle, not at the start. And the question of what preceded it remains open. The second component is the poorly documented period, just before the official starting point. In case after case, researchers who push backward past the official starting point find the same thing. The documentation thins. The records become fragmentary. The questions that are most important to answer, about the source of early capital, about the nature of foundational relationships, about the specific circumstances that made the first documented moment possible, receive answers that are partial at best and absent at worst. The period just before the story officially begins is consistently the period that the archive covers least clearly. At first, this seems like a simple archival observation. Earlier periods have less surviving documentation. That is generally true across the historical record. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the thinning of the documentation is not uniform across all aspects of the record. In the same archives, other types of records from the same early period survive reasonably well. What is specifically thin is the material that would speak most directly to the pre-wealth formation period of the institution in question. The thinning is selective, and its selectivity consistently favors the period and the activities that would be most explanatory. The third component is the rate inconsistency. The documented growth of these institutions, when subjected to careful financial reconstruction, does not always match what the documented activities could have produced. The capital available at key moments appears to exceed what the traceable inputs would generate. The trajectory from documented starting point to documented outcome contains gaps that the standard explanations, informal arrangements, imprecise accounting, incomplete records, account for conceptually but not evidentially. The remainder after all documented sources are credited is not always small, and it tends to be largest precisely at the transition points where the documentation is also thinnest. The fourth component is the missing relationship origins. The most consequential alliances, the partnerships that enabled the largest expansions, the connections that opened the most significant networks, are the ones that appear in the record already established, without a visible beginning. In the same archives where minor working relationships are documented from their first moments, the foundational alliances of the institution appear fully formed. No introduction, no early correspondence, no first meeting, simply a connection already in place, operating at a level of trust and familiarity that takes time to develop, with no record of the time it took. These four components, the convenient starting point, the thin prehistory, the rate inconsistency, and the missing relationship origins, appear together across multiple cases. Not always all four in every case. Sometimes three of the four. Sometimes the emphasis is on one component more than the others, but the structural combination, in some form, appears repeatedly, across different centuries, across different regions of Europe and beyond, across different industries, early banking, long-distance trade, the financing of political institutions, the development of major commercial enterprises. The pattern is not confined to one type of institution or one historical period. It crosses those boundaries. Some researchers have argued, carefully and with supporting evidence, that this pattern reflects nothing more than the nature of historical record-keeping in the relevant periods, that informal economies were large, that archives were incomplete and selectively preserved, that the survival of documents over centuries is a process shaped by many factors that have nothing to do with the content of what was documented, that the pattern, in other words, is a product of how history is recorded and preserved rather than a product of what actually happened. This position has real merit. It draws on genuine features of how historical archives function, and it cannot be simply dismissed. But others disagree, and their disagreement is specific rather than general. They point out that if the pattern were purely a product of archival conditions, of how records were kept and how they survived, then the pattern should appear across the historical record broadly. It should be as visible in the history of institutions that accumulated modest wealth as in the history of those that accumulated significant wealth. It should appear in the records of families and enterprises that remained regional and limited in influence as much as in those that became historically consequential. If archival conditions are the explanation, the pattern should not discriminate by outcome, but it does appear to discriminate. The structural pattern, the convenient starting point, the thin prehistory, the rate inconsistency, the missing relationship origins, appears more consistently in the histories of institutions and families that reached the highest levels of wealth and influence than in those that remained more limited in scope. That correlation does not prove that the pattern reflects something about what actually happened rather than how records were kept, but it raises a question that the archival explanation does not comfortably answer. Why would the archival conditions that produced this pattern be specifically associated with the cases that reached the greatest scale? Neither side of this debate has produced a definitive answer. The researchers who favor the archival explanation have not been able to fully account for why the pattern correlates with scale. The researchers who believe the pattern reflects something about the actual process of accumulation have not been able to produce the documentary evidence that would confirm what that something is. The debate is genuine. It involves serious scholars working with real historical material, and it has not been resolved. However, the timeline of the debate itself is worth noting. The observation that a structural pattern exists across multiple cases of major wealth formation is not new. It has been discussed in academic literature for several decades, and in that time, the archival explanation has remained the dominant one, not because it has conclusively addressed all of the objections raised against it, but because it is the most conservative explanation available. It requires the fewest additional assumptions. It fits within the existing framework of how historians understand the limitations of their sources, and in the absence of specific documentary evidence for an alternative, the most conservative explanation tends to hold the field. But conservative explanations and complete explanations are not the same thing. An explanation can be the most reasonable available inference from the existing evidence and still leave significant questions open. And the structural pattern that this investigation has been describing, present across enough cases, consistent enough in its components, correlated enough with scale to resist easy dismissal, does leave significant questions open. Questions that the dominant explanation acknowledges, but does not fully resolve. The existence of the pattern itself is not in dispute among researchers who have examined the relevant material carefully. The disagreement is about its meaning, about whether it reflects the mechanics of historical documentation or the mechanics of historical accumulation, about whether what is visible in the pattern is a feature of how records are made and preserved, or a feature of how major wealth was actually assembled before it became visible enough to be formally recorded. That question, the question of what the pattern means, is where the investigation genuinely remains open, not because researchers have not tried to answer it, but because the evidence available through the surviving record is not sufficient to close it. The pattern is there. Its components are identifiable and recurring. Its correlation with scale is observable, and the explanation for why it appears so consistently across so many unrelated cases, in so many different historical contexts, that part remains, after careful and sustained scholarly attention, genuinely and honestly unresolved. Up to this point, the questions raised by this investigation have remained largely within the boundaries of financial and institutional history. The rate inconsistencies, the missing relationship origins, the documentation gaps at key transitions, the structural pattern that repeats across multiple cases. These are problems that live primarily in the archives. They concern ledgers, correspondence, reconstruction methodologies, and the limits of what surviving documents can tell us about the process of early wealth formation. They are serious questions, but they are, in a certain sense, contain questions. Questions about specific institutions and specific families and the specific periods in which they first became significant. But the difficulty does not stay contained within those boundaries. It expands. And understanding how it expands, what territories it enters once it moves beyond the history of specific families and institutions, is important, because the expansion is not speculative. It follows directly from the nature of what major wealth does once it is established. It does not remain a private matter. It connects outward. It reaches into the structures that organize public life, into legal systems, into political arrangements, into the frameworks that govern how property is held, how credit is extended, how inheritance works, how commercial activity is regulated. Major wealth, at the scale being examined here, does not exist in isolation from those structures. It shapes them, and if the origin of the wealth is unclear, then the shaping that followed from it carries that same unclarity forward. This is the point at which the question stops being purely historical and starts being structural. But others disagree, and their disagreement is specific rather than general. They point out that if the pattern were purely a product of archival conditions, of how records were kept and how they survived, then the pattern should appear across the historical record broadly. It should be as visible in the history of institutions that accumulated modest wealth as in the history of those that accumulated significant wealth. It should appear in the records of families and enterprises that remained regional and limited in influence as much as in those that became historically consequential. If archival conditions are the explanation, the pattern should not discriminate by outcome, but it does appear to discriminate. The structural pattern, the convenient starting point, the thin prehistory, the rate inconsistency, the missing relationship origins, appears more consistently in the histories of institutions and families that reached the highest levels of wealth and influence than in those that remained more limited in scope. That correlation does not prove that the pattern reflects something about what actually happened rather than how records were kept, but it raises a question that the archival explanation does not comfortably answer. Why would the archival conditions that produced this pattern be specifically associated with the cases that reached the greatest scale? Neither side of this debate has produced a definitive answer. The researchers who favor the archival explanation have not been able to fully account for why the pattern correlates with scale. The researchers who believe the pattern reflects something about the actual process of accumulation have not been able to produce the documentary evidence that would confirm what that something is. The debate is genuine. It involves serious scholars working with real historical material, and it has not been resolved. However, the timeline of the debate itself is worth noting. The observation that a structural pattern exists across multiple cases of major wealth formation is not new. It has been discussed in academic literature for several decades, and in that time, the archival explanation has remained the dominant one, not because it has conclusively addressed all of the objections raised against it, but because it is the most conservative explanation available. It requires the fewest additional assumptions. It fits within the existing framework of how historians understand the limitations of their sources, and in the absence of specific documentary evidence for an alternative, the most conservative explanation tends to hold the field. But conservative explanations and complete explanations are not the same thing. An explanation can be the most reasonable available inference from the existing evidence and still leave significant questions open. And the structural pattern that this investigation has been describing, present across enough cases, consistent enough in its components, correlated enough with scale to resist easy dismissal, does leave significant questions open. Questions that the dominant explanation acknowledges, but does not fully resolve. The existence of the pattern itself is not in dispute among researchers who have examined the relevant material carefully. The disagreement is about its meaning, about whether it reflects the mechanics of historical documentation or the mechanics of historical accumulation, about whether what is visible in the pattern is a feature of how records are made and preserved, or a feature of how major wealth was actually assembled before it became visible enough to be formally recorded. That question, the question of what the pattern means, is where the investigation genuinely remains open, not because researchers have not tried to answer it, but because the evidence available through the surviving record is not sufficient to close it. The pattern is there. Its components are identifiable and recurring. Its correlation with scale is observable, and the explanation for why it appears so consistently across so many unrelated cases, in so many different historical contexts, that part remains, after careful and sustained scholarly attention, genuinely and honestly unresolved. Up to this point, the questions raised by this investigation have remained largely within the boundaries of financial and institutional history. The rate inconsistencies, the missing relationship origins, the documentation gaps at key transitions, the structural pattern that repeats across multiple cases. These are problems that live primarily in the archives. They concern ledgers, correspondence, reconstruction methodologies, and the limits of what surviving documents can tell us about the process of early wealth formation. They are serious questions, but they are, in a certain sense, contained questions. Questions about specific institutions and specific families and the specific periods in which they first became significant. But the difficulty does not stay contained within those boundaries. It expands. And understanding how it expands, what territories it enters once it moves beyond the history of specific families and institutions, is important, because the expansion is not speculative. It follows directly from the nature of what major wealth does once it is established. It does not remain a private matter. It connects outward. It reaches into the structures that organize public life, into legal systems, into political arrangements, into the frameworks that govern how property is held, how credit is extended, how inheritance works, how commercial activity is regulated. Major wealth, at the scale being examined here, does not exist in isolation from those structures. It shapes them, and if the origin of the wealth is unclear, then the shaping that followed from it carries that same unclarity forward, not in the sense of conspiracy or deliberate design. Those are stronger claims than the evidence supports, but in the simpler and more verifiable sense that the legal and political frameworks which govern large areas of economic life were not created in a neutral environment. They were created in an environment already shaped by existing concentrations of wealth and influence. And those concentrations of wealth and influence had origins that, as this investigation has been examining, the official record does not fully account for. Some historians have documented this process carefully and specifically. The legal frameworks that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, the bodies of law governing credit, property rights, inheritance, and the organization of commercial enterprises, did not develop in a vacuum. They developed through a legislative and political process, and that process was not insulated from the interests of those who already held significant financial power. Researchers who have examined the historical record of how these frameworks were debated and written have noted, with care and precision, that the resulting laws reflected priorities and protections that were substantially aligned with the interests of already powerful financial actors. This is accepted history. It is not a fringe observation or a polemical claim. Serious legal historians and economic historians have documented the ways in which early modern legal frameworks were shaped by the needs and preferences of those who were already operating at the highest levels of commerce and finance. The laws were not designed in isolation from the interests they would govern. The people with the most to gain or lose from particular legal arrangements were present, directly or through representatives and advocates, in the processes that produced those arrangements. And the outcomes, in many cases, reflected that presence. The debate among historians is not about whether this happened. It did. The debate is about a different question, about how those concentrations of influence that shaped the legal frameworks came to exist in the first place, about what produced them, about whether the foundation beneath them was built through the purely documented and legitimate channels that the official origin stories describe, or whether it included the undocumented and informal elements that earlier parts of this investigation have been examining. And this is where the expansion of the problem becomes significant, because the answer to that question matters for how the resulting legal and political structures are understood. If the foundational wealth was assembled through fully documented and entirely legitimate means, through the ordinary commercial activities that the official record describes, then the influence that wealth later exercised over legal and political frameworks, while worth examining critically, follows a traceable and relatively straightforward logic. Wealth produced through legitimate commerce generates legitimate influence. That influence shapes legal frameworks in ways that favor the conditions which produce the wealth. The process is not neutral, but it is at least traceable. Its origins are visible. But if the foundational wealth included elements that the official record does not capture, informal arrangements, undocumented sources of early capital, relationships formed through channels that were kept off the main record, then the influence that followed from that wealth rests on a foundation that is less transparent than it appears. The legal frameworks that emerged from that influence were shaped by concentrations of power whose own origins contain unexplained components. The structures that govern large areas of economic life today were built on foundations whose full nature has not been clearly established. That is a different picture from the one the official account presents, not necessarily more sinister, but significantly less clear. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because legal frameworks, once established, do not simply reflect the conditions of their creation, and then become neutral. They persist. They develop their own logic. They generate precedents that accumulate over time, and they create conditions that tend to favor the continuation of whatever concentrations of power were present when they were formed. A legal framework that was shaped by the interests of already powerful financial actors does not automatically correct for that shaping over time. It embeds it. It normalizes it. It makes the conditions that produce the framework look like simply the natural order of things, rather than the outcome of a specific historical process with specific origins. This is why the origin matters, not only as a historical question about what happened in a particular century, but as a structural question about how the persistence of certain arrangements is explained and legitimized. If the origin was clean, if the foundational wealth was assembled through the channels the official record describes, then the durability of the structures that followed from it reflects their genuine utility. They worked because they were well designed. They persisted because the conditions that produced them were real and sustainable. That is one explanation for the durability of certain legal and institutional structures across centuries. But if the origin was less clean, if the foundational wealth included components that the official record does not capture, and if the influence that shaped subsequent legal and political frameworks was built on that incomplete foundation, then the durability of the resulting structures reflects something additional. It reflects the way that embedded structures tend to protect their own foundations, the way that legal frameworks, once in place, create conditions that favor those who benefited from their creation, the way that institutions built on a particular distribution of power tend to reproduce the conditions that sustain that distribution, not through active conspiracy, simply through the normal functioning of systems that were designed, in their original form, to favor particular interests. This raises questions that extend well beyond the specific families and institutions that this investigation has been examining, because the legal and institutional frameworks shaped by these concentrations of influence are not limited in their effect to the specific actors who shape them. They apply broadly. They govern the conditions under which commercial activity occurs for everyone within their reach. The rules of credit, the protections of property, the mechanisms of inheritance, the organization of enterprises. These are not narrow matters. They are the foundational conditions of economic life. And if they were shaped in a specific direction during a formative period by concentrations of influence whose own origins are incompletely understood, then the question of what those origins actually were is not a purely historical curiosity. It is a question about the foundations of structures that remain relevant. Some historians are cautious about drawing this line too directly. They note that legal frameworks evolve continuously, that the frameworks of the 17th and 18th centuries have been modified, reformed, and in many respects transformed by subsequent legislation and political change. That tracing a direct line from the influence of historical financial actors on early modern law to the legal conditions of the present day is a complex and uncertain exercise. These are fair cautions. The connection is real, but it is not simple. Centuries of change intervene between the formative period and the present, and the claim that present conditions are directly determined by the influence of specific historical actors on specific historical legislation would require a much more detailed and careful argument than this investigation has presented. But the more limited version of the claim is already significant, that certain foundational frameworks were shaped during a period when specific concentrations of wealth exercised substantial influence over the conditions of their creation. That those concentrations of wealth had origins that the official record does not fully account for, and that the frameworks which emerged from that process have proven remarkably durable, not necessarily because they were designed to be durable in perpetuity, but because embedded legal structures tend to generate the conditions that sustain them. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the durability of the structures is itself part of what makes the origin question hard to examine. Structures that have been in place for long enough come to seem natural. Their origins recede. The historical process that produced them becomes less visible with each passing generation. What was once a specific outcome of a specific historical moment, shaped by specific actors with specific interests, operating on a foundation whose full nature was never fully transparent, begins to look like simply the way things are, the way they have always been. the natural order rather than the historical product. Examining the origin of major wealth forces a confrontation with that appearance of naturalness. It asks whether the structures that seem simply to be the given conditions of economic life are in fact the durable outcomes of a foundational process that was never fully visible. Whether what appears to be the natural order is in part the product of a specific historical accumulation, an accumulation whose origins remain, in key respects, unclear. The origin shapes what follows. This is not a theoretical claim. It is an observation about how foundational processes work. What is built first determines the conditions under which everything built afterward must operate. If the foundation is clearly understood, then the structure erected on it can be evaluated with full information. If the foundation contains elements that are not clearly understood, elements that the official account does not fully illuminate, then the structure above it rests on something whose full nature has not been established. And that uncertainty does not resolve itself with the passage of time. It simply becomes less visible, present in the foundation, carrying forward into everything built upon it, and remaining, despite all the attention this investigation has brought to it, genuinely and persistently unclear. When an investigation reaches the point where the official explanation has been examined carefully and found to be incomplete, the next natural step is to ask what alternative explanations have been proposed, not to accept any one of them uncritically, not to replace one incomplete account with another, but to understand what different researchers, working seriously with the same gaps and the same questions, have concluded when they looked at the material from different angles. Because the gaps in the official record have not gone unnoticed. They have attracted sustained scholarly attention, and that attention has produced several distinct positions, not a single unified alternative, but a set of different interpretive frameworks, each with its own logic, its own evidence, and its own limitations. It is worth being clear about what this part of the investigation is and is not. It is not a presentation of fringe theories or speculation disconnected from serious research. The positions described here have been developed and defended by researchers working within academic institutions, using archival sources, and publishing their findings in contexts where they are subject to scholarly scrutiny and debate. They are genuine intellectual positions. They disagree with each other in important ways, and none of them has achieved the kind of broad acceptance that would allow it to be described as a new consensus. But they represent the most developed attempts, within serious scholarship, to account for what the official record leaves unexplained. The first of these positions is built around a concept that some researchers call shadow capital. The term refers to wealth accumulated through channels that were technically permissible by the standards and laws of their own time, but that would not be recognized as legitimate by later and more developed legal and ethical standards. This is an important distinction. The shadow capital framework does not claim that the actors involved were breaking the rules of their era. It claims that the rules of their era permitted things that later eras came to prohibit or condemn, and that the wealth generated through those permitted but later unacceptable channels is what fills the gap between the official narrative and the actual trajectory of accumulation. The specific channels identified under this framework vary depending on the period and region being examined. War profiteering is one of the most commonly cited. In periods of military conflict, those with access to credit and supply networks could profit enormously from the needs of armies and governments, selling provisions, extending loans that carried high interest rates, justified by the risk of the period, and converting the instability of war into financial advantage. These activities were not illegal. They were, in many cases, encouraged or at least tolerated by the political actors who needed the services being provided. But they also operated with minimal documentation, through trusted networks, and in ways that the participants had reasons not to advertise. Monopoly arrangements enforced through political connections represent another channel identified in the shadow capital framework. In early modern commercial history, the line between legitimate commerce and politically enforced advantage was often thin. Exclusive trading rights, granted by political authorities in exchange for financial support, gave certain actors advantages that had nothing to do with commercial efficiency or market competition. The wealth generated through these arrangements was real. It was substantial, but it was produced through mechanisms that depended on political proximity rather than market performance. And those mechanisms, in most official accounts of the origin of major fortunes, receive less emphasis than the commercial skill and judgment of the actors involved. Early colonial extraction is a third channel discussed under this framework. The economic processes that accompanied colonial expansion in the early modern period produced significant flows of wealth towards certain actors in the metropolitan centers of commercial and political power. Those flows were normalized within the frameworks of the time. They were not considered problematic by the standards of the era in which they occurred, but they also operated through mechanisms of extraction and coercion that the official origin stories of the institutions that benefited from them tend not to describe in direct terms. The wealth arrived. The official account describes what was done with it from a certain point forward. What produced it, and through what mechanisms, is treated with considerably more discretion. Proponents of the shadow capital framework argue that the documentation gaps in the official record are a natural consequence of how these channels operated. Transactions conducted through trusted intermediaries, in the context of political arrangements that neither party wanted to make fully public, in relation to activities that were normalized in their time but would later become difficult to discuss openly. These are exactly the kinds of transactions that would produce minimal written records. The absence of documentation is not an archival accident. It reflects the character of what was being done, and the result is that the official record, which captures the more transparent and formally documented layer of activity, systematically understates the full picture of how the foundational wealth was assembled. A different group of researchers approaches the same gaps from a different angle. Their focus is not on the source of capital, but on the role of information. They argue that the foundational advantage in many of these cases was not primarily financial at all. It was informational. Certain actors, in the formative periods of major wealth accumulation, had access to information that was not available to others. Information about political decisions that had not yet been made public, about military outcomes that had not yet been announced, about currency changes that were being planned at the highest levels of government, about trade negotiations whose results would significantly affect the value of particular assets or the viability of particular commercial routes. This kind of advance information, the argument goes, was the real foundation of early accumulation, not because the actors who possessed it acted in ways that were formally illegal by the standards of their time, but because access to non-public information is an advantage that produces results disproportionate to the apparent activity. An actor who knows, before the market knows, that a particular currency will be devalued, or that a particular military campaign will succeed or fail, can position themselves to benefit from that outcome in ways that look, from the outside, like exceptional commercial judgment. The rate of accumulation appears faster than the documented activity would explain. The decisions appear better than chance or skill alone would produce, and the documentation of how the advantage was obtained is absent because the advantage was informational rather than transactional, and information leaves fewer traces than capital. But this is where the informational framework encounters its own limitation, because demonstrating that informational advantage existed and that specific actors benefited from it requires documentation that is typically not available. The existence of advance access to non-public information in these periods is plausible. It is consistent with what is known about how political and commercial networks operated, but establishing that specific actors possessed specific information at specific moments and acted on it in specific ways requires evidence that the surviving record rarely provides. The framework is logically coherent. Its explanatory power is significant, but its evidentiary basis is, in most cases, indirect rather than direct. A third perspective takes a fundamentally different approach to the gaps, and it is worth presenting this position carefully and fairly, because it represents a genuine scholarly position rather than simply a defense of the status quo. Some historians argue that the gaps in the official record, while real, are not as significant as the first two frameworks suggest. That wealth accumulation has always been messier than the official record presents, that informal arrangements, undocumented transactions, and imprecise accounting are universal features of commercial history rather than specific characteristics of particular cases, and that applying the analytical weight of the shadow capital or informational frameworks to what may simply be the normal messiness of historical commerce leads to speculation that exceeds what the evidence can support. Proponents of this position argue that the pattern identified across multiple cases, the convenient starting points, the thin prehistories, the rate inconsistencies, the missing relationship origins, is partly a product of how the investigation is framed. That when you go looking for gaps, you find them. That when you treat every piece of missing documentation as potentially significant rather than simply incomplete, you create the appearance of a pattern that may not reflect a genuine structural feature of the cases being examined. That the more conservative and more defensible interpretation of the gaps is that they reflect the ordinary limitations of historical archives, applied to cases that attract scrutiny because of their later prominence rather than because their origins were genuinely different from those of other commercial actors in the same period. This is a serious methodological point, and it cannot be dismissed simply because it defends the adequacy of the official account. The risk of confirmation bias in any investigation that begins by looking for gaps is real. The tendency to see significance in absence, to interpret missing documentation as meaningful rather than simply missing, is a genuine analytical danger. The skeptical position serves as an important check on the interpretive overreach that the other frameworks risk. However, the timeline does not fully match the skeptical reassurance either, because the skeptical position, in its strongest form, predicts that the gaps should be distributed without regard to the scale or consequence of the outcomes they precede. If the gaps are simply normal historical messiness, they should appear as often before modest outcomes as before major ones. But the structural pattern that has been identified in this investigation tends to be associated specifically with the cases of greatest scale. That correlation is not what the purely skeptical account predicts, and it is a feature of the material that the skeptical position has not fully explained away. Each of these three positions, the shadow capital framework, the informational advantage framework, and the skeptical framework, has evidence supporting it. Each addresses real features of the historical material. Each has limitations that prevent it from being accepted as the complete and final answer, and they cannot all be right simultaneously, because they offer fundamentally different accounts of what the gaps mean. If the gaps reflect shadow capital channels, then the informational framework is at most a supplementary explanation. If the gaps reflect primarily informational advantage, then the scale of shadow capital activity may be overstated. And if the gaps reflect simply normal historical messiness, then both of the other frameworks are reading more into the material than it actually contains. What all three positions share, and this is the one point of genuine agreement among researchers who otherwise disagree significantly, is the conclusion that the official record, as it currently stands, is not sufficient to fully explain what happened. The official account is acknowledged by researchers across all three frameworks to be incomplete. The disagreement is about what kind of incompleteness it represents, whether the missing portion reflects shadow channels, informational advantages, or simply ordinary archival gaps. That question remains open, but the insufficiency of the official account itself is not contested among those who have examined the material most carefully, and that shared conclusion is itself significant. It is not a fringe observation. It is the considered judgment of researchers working across different interpretive frameworks, from different starting assumptions, toward different proposed explanations. They agree on the gap even when they disagree on what fills it. And the question of what fills it, what actually happened in the periods and through the channels that the official record does not clearly illuminate, remains, across all three frameworks, genuinely and honestly unresolved. After examining the timelines carefully, after working through the inconsistencies in the official record, after tracing the structural pattern across multiple unrelated cases, and after considering the different explanations that serious researchers have proposed, the honest place to arrive is not at a conclusion. It is at a recognition that the central question of this investigation remains, despite all of the attention brought to it, genuinely and honestly open. Not partially open, not almost answered, genuinely open, in the way that questions remain open when the evidence available is insufficient to close them, and when the explanations on offer are each incomplete in ways that matter. What happened before their wealth appeared in official history? That question was posed at the beginning of this investigation. It has been examined from multiple directions. The official record has been described and assessed. Its limitations have been identified. The mathematical problems in the documented trajectory have been examined. The environmental conditions of the foundational periods have been considered. The missing relationship origins have been noted. The structural pattern across cases has been described. The alternative frameworks that researchers have proposed have been laid out and evaluated. And after all of that, the question remains, not because the investigation failed to engage with the material seriously, but because the material itself does not contain a complete answer. The official answer to the question exists. It is a set of documented events, documented transactions, documented relationships, and documented timelines that together describe the process of accumulation in terms that are internally consistent and supported by verifiable archival sources. That answer is real. It is not fabricated. The documents it references are genuine. The events it describes occurred. The official account, within the scope of what it covers, is defensible. But the scope of what it covers is not the full scope of what needs to be explained. The rate of accumulation, in several well-studied cases, is not fully accounted for by the documented activities within the documented period. The early relationships that proved most consequential appear in the record without visible origins, while less important relationships are documented from their first moments. The documentation gaps cluster at the transition points where understanding is most needed, rather than distributing evenly across the timeline in the way that random archival incompleteness would produce. And the structural pattern formed by these features repeats across cases that are otherwise unrelated. Different centuries, different regions, different industries, different institutions, in a way that makes purely local explanations difficult to sustain. These are not minor loose ends in an otherwise complete account. They are not peripheral details that leave the central picture intact. They concern the foundational period directly. They concern the process by which the first significant accumulation occurred. They concern the relationships and the sources of capital that made everything documented afterward possible. The gaps are located at the center of what needs to be understood, not at its edges, and the official account, as it stands, does not fill them with the kind of direct and documented evidence that the significance of those gaps would seem to require. That does not confirm any particular alternative explanation. This is an important point, and it is worth stating clearly. The incompleteness of the official account does not validate the shadow capital framework, or the informational advantage framework, or any other specific alternative. An incomplete explanation is not the same as a wrong one, and the space created by the official account's incompleteness is not automatically filled by whichever alternative account seems most plausible. The gap is real. What fills it is not established. Those are two separate things, and keeping them separate is necessary for intellectual honesty. What the incompleteness of the official account does mean is that the explanation which exists, the documented, accepted, broadly referenced account of how major foundational wealth was assembled, is not sufficient to answer the question fully. It answers part of it, possibly a large part of it, but not all of it, and the portion it does not answer is not a negligible remainder. It is a structural feature of the foundational period that appears consistently enough, across enough different cases, to constitute a genuine and unresolved problem in the historical record. Some researchers believe that the missing pieces, if they were ever found, would reveal something significant, that the gaps in the official record correspond to real activities and real channels of accumulation that were deliberately kept off the main documentary record, not necessarily because they were illegal by the standards of time, but because they were the kind of activities that neither party had reason to document, that if the full picture were ever reconstructed, it would look meaningfully different from the official account, not in every respect, but in ways that matter for understanding how foundational wealth was actually built and what kind of foundation it actually represents. Others believe the opposite, that the gaps reflect nothing more than the ordinary and unavoidable imperfections of historical record-keeping across centuries, that informal arrangements were universal in the relevant periods, and that their absence from the official record is not meaningful, that the structural pattern identified across cases is partly a product of how the analysis is framed, that looking for gaps across multiple cases will always produce the appearance of a pattern, regardless of whether a genuine structural feature is present, that the most intellectually responsible position is to acknowledge the incompleteness of the record without inferring that the missing portion contains something the official account would not recognize. Both positions are held by serious researchers. Both have supporting arguments. Both acknowledge the same underlying observation, that the official record is incomplete in ways that center on the foundational period. And both, despite their disagreement about what the incompleteness means, arrive at the same practical result: uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of insufficient attention or insufficient scholarship, the uncertainty of an evidentiary situation that does not resolve cleanly in either direction, where the available material is genuinely insufficient to confirm the official account as complete, and genuinely insufficient to establish any particular alternative as correct. That kind of uncertainty is uncomfortable. Investigations are expected to move toward resolution. Questions are posed in order to be answered. But there is a form of intellectual honesty that requires acknowledging when the evidence does not support a clean resolution, when the most accurate description of the current state of knowledge is that the question remains open, not because no one has tried to answer it, but because the material available for answering it has limits that no amount of careful analysis can currently overcome. The wealth is documented. That is not in question. The great institutions and dynasties that this investigation has been examining were real. The capital they accumulated was real. The influence they exercised was real. The transactions they conducted from a certain point forward are recorded in surviving archives that researchers have examined in detail. The documented portion of the story is substantial and verifiable. The outcomes, the scale of what was eventually built, the reach of the influence that followed from it, the durability of the structures it helped to shape, all of that is visible and real. But the specific process by which the foundation beneath all of that was laid, in that particular period, in the years, and sometimes decades, just before the official story begins, that process remains unclear, not completely unknown. The official account provides a partial picture. The alternative frameworks provide additional partial pictures from different angles, but no complete and evidentially supported account of the foundational period exists. The foundation itself, what it was made of, how it was assembled, what channels were used and what arrangements were made, and what relationships were formed during the period before the documentation becomes clear, that is what remains unresolved. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult to leave, because the instinct of any sustained investigation is to push toward resolution, to find the answer, to close the question. But closing a question prematurely, settling on an explanation because it is the most available one, or the most comfortable one, or the one that requires the fewest additional assumptions, is a different thing from actually resolving it. And the honest assessment of where this investigation ends is that the question has not been resolved. It has been examined. The shape of the gap has been described. The reasons for the gap have been debated. The alternative explanations have been evaluated. But the gap remains. Perhaps the most useful recognition to carry from this investigation is a structural one, not about any specific family or institution, but about the relationship between the official historical record and the actual process of foundational accumulation. The official record begins where the documentation becomes clear. That is its nature. It works with what survives and what is verifiable. It builds the most coherent account it can from the material available, and within its own scope, it does that work seriously and with considerable care. But the official record does not begin where the process began. It begins where the evidence allows a clear narrative. And those 2 points, where the process began and where the narrative becomes clear, are not always the same. Between them lies a period that the official account cannot fully illuminate, not because it refuses to look, but because the material that would allow it to look clearly is either absent, incomplete, or present in forms that do not yield the kind of direct and verifiable answers the official method requires. That period, the space between where the process actually began and where the official narrative picks it up, is what this investigation has been examining, and it remains, after all of that examination, in the same condition it was in at the start, imperfectly understood, partially described, open to interpretation in ways that serious researchers have not resolved, carrying questions that the official record was not designed to answer and has not, in the course of the scholarship examined here, managed to answer through other means. The question posed at the beginning of this investigation, what happened before their wealth appeared in official history, is not a question without an answer. It has partial answers. It has proposed answers. It has the official answer and several alternative ones. What it does not have is a complete, evidentially supported, broadly accepted answer that accounts for all of the features of the foundational period that the investigation has identified as significant. And perhaps that is the most honest place to leave this, not with a conclusion that settles the matter, but with a clear-eyed recognition of where the matter actually stands. The question has been asked seriously. The available evidence has been examined carefully. The explanations on offer have been evaluated with as much fairness as the material allows. And the result is not resolution. It is a more precise understanding of what remains unresolved, of where the gaps are, of why they matter, and of why the period before the official history began may contain information about how foundational wealth was actually assembled and what kind of foundation it actually represents, that the official history, by its nature and by its design, was never fully equipped to show.